And we're back with another episode of Before You Buy, the show where we give you some straight up gameplay and our first impressions. I'm Falcon, and today we are playing the Call of Cthulhu, the official video game. And there's a couple of ways to go about saying how this game is. Before I go into them, I'm gonna say it's a pretty good game. It's nothing earth-shaking, it's not gonna blow your mind, but it's worth talking about it from a couple of different angles. And I think the first thing to do is to approach it just specifically as a game. Pretend there's no other source material at all, pretend it's just a game, and it is a slow starter. I've played at this point about 7 hours of the game, and it's only the last couple hours that it really started to come into its own as a story. And there's a minor issue with that on account this is first and foremost a narrative game. The protagonist is Edward Pierce, a private detective who is, well, let's just say sauced when we meet him. He's having a weird dream. We catch him in the middle of it, he wakes up. The weird dream more or less goes ahead and seeds a lot of what happens later, and it does kind of say a few things about the plot, but it makes the game seem like it's going to be interesting quickly, and then you sort of mull around in your office for a while. Hey, here's a book. Hey, these books are useless until I take a drink and answer the phone and somebody comes in, and then I actually do some detective work on a photo, and then I have to go to an island, and then I have to, it's really and then storytelling. And in a narrative game, that's not very good. You want a few, this happens, but then this happens. Not so much of that for a while. It's mainly event and event and event, rather than event and event, but monkey wrench. Once it does get going later, and I don't want to ruin things because it does actually get a lot more interesting later, once you get over the more basic detective elements of the story and into the more occult elements, it starts to become a much more unique story. Now that is taking the game specifically as a video game that has no other source material. If you are aware of H.P. Lovecraft source material, you might feel a little bit different because you more or less understand some of the imagery that you see in the first little while. I've personally read a fair amount of Lovecraft and understand kind of what's going on. I know where the story is going, more or less. And while it is not a direct adaptation of the short story Call of Cthulhu, I haven't really played the pen and paper RPG, but supposedly it draws a lot of influence from that. There's a lot going on that more or less will feel familiar to a Lovecraft fan. Now, as for the gameplay, this is in a lot of ways not terribly far off from The Vanishing of Ethan Carter. If you've ever played that game, it's a really good narrative detective game, and I don't know exactly how much inspiration was drawn from it, but I kept thinking of it, and in some ways, you're gonna say to yourself, I'm walking around an island looking for clues, putting something together, and it's true, this game feels very, very familiar. If you've played a detective-oriented narrative game, at any point in the last probably 8 years, you more or less understand what you're doing here. Now, Edward Pierce has the ability to go into these sort of reconstruction pieces in which he moves around a room and reconstructs what happened in that room, but it's not something that we've never seen before, and it's not something that blows my mind. I'm not going to say that there aren't cool observations that are very personal and character-driven, and I think that that's neat, but it felt like they weren't utilized enough at times, and that they probably could have broken up the gameplay a little bit more if they had been used a little more liberally. Aside from that, it's kind of walk around, look for things, talk to people, and progress the story, which again, we've seen plenty of at this point, and it's not that it's bad, it's just that it's a bit familiar, and although it is very faithful to the story, or at least the lore of Cthulhu, in its own certain way, there are deviations, but some of the visuals are really, really cool. It is a game that establishes a genuinely scary atmosphere, and it does a good job of maintaining it. The color palette, although, is sometimes a little bit limiting, and I find myself curious as to why. Everywhere on this island kind of looks the same, unless suddenly it's dealing with occult stuff, and then it looks a bit different. It's kind of too simple of a visual scheme, which kind of sucks because the game otherwise looks very nice. I like the art style of the characters, I like the environmental style, I just wish some more had been done to differentiate between places, because I kind of always feel like I'm in similar places. And that links into the same problem with the gameplay, where the gameplay often feels very samey, very familiar, very repetitive at times. Now, the game itself actually doesn't feel too long. It's just that once you get over the sort of initial hump, once the occult things start happening a little more frequently, and the protagonist is more seriously questioning his own sanity and where he fits in with this plot, it starts to get a bit more interesting. But keep in mind, that was 3-4 hours of gameplay where I was just getting little teases of what may be to come later. Again, if you're aware of the mythology, those little teases felt like fan service. And that's basically what it felt like to me, but to somebody who's like, Call of Cthulhu, I want to see what this is about, it may not feel like enough. It's not really that big of a tease when you have no idea what it is. It kind of just gives you a visually unsettling image and doesn't give you a lot of what's going on in it, so to speak, which doesn't allow the mind to wander in the way that I probably would have liked. But again, I am talking from the perspective of somebody who was aware of what was more or less going on. I, again, don't want to say it's 100% faithful, but it's pretty faithful. Now, there's not a lot more to it than what I've talked about here. There's story segments, walking segments, investigative segments, and a lot of it looks very similar. So why am I willing to say it's pretty good as opposed to pretty bland? It's really because the voice acting and characterization is pretty good, actually. There are a few moments where you're saying to yourself, that is interesting, okay? But for the most part, it does feel like a well-acted, intriguing, well-characterized tale, and that keeps me around. I probably will finish it, because I am liking the game and I do enjoy the Cthulhu mythos, and I think that for some people who have no idea what any of this stuff is, it might still work out to be a pretty good game in their eyes if they can get past the first few hours, which are a bit slow. But for an entirely uninitiated person, somebody who isn't terribly invested in Lovecraftian horror, maybe you don't need to play this game, but you might even like it. There's stealth, horror elements, investigative elements, and it does give you at least a decent amount to do. But again, it's very familiar and doesn't really progress the genre in any serious way. It's just good characterization, good voice acting, in a competent retelling of a Lovecraftian horror tale. What do you think? Have you played Call of Cthulhu? Have you beaten Call of Cthulhu? Leave us a comment, tell us what you think, and if you enjoyed this video, please click like. If you want to see more of our videos, which we upload every single day, click subscribe and do not forget to click the alarm bell. As always, we thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon the Hero, and we'll see you next time right here on Game Ranks.